My husband thought he was putting a clueless country girl in her place when he ripped a wine menu from my hands at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, and whispered for me not to embarrass him in front of his senior partner and his overly affectionate work wife. He assumed I was just a naive farm girl who had never seen a truffle. He had no idea that the dirty farm he constantly mocked was actually a $400 million vineyard syndicate. He also did not know that the billionaire logistics CEO he was desperately preparing to pitch his career-defining project to was my younger brother. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of a narcissistic partner before destroying their ego. My name is Maddie, 33 years old, and until that suffocating Tuesday evening, I spent 5 years shrinking myself to fit my husband Derek's fragile worldview. Derek was 35, a corporate climber desperate to project wealth he did not possess. I preferred a low-profile existence, keeping my family's wealth hidden to ensure our relationship was built on love. Unfortunately, Derek interpreted my simple wardrobe and quiet demeanor as proof that I was beneath him. The tension at our table inside Il Cielo was palpable from the moment we sat down. The restaurant was a cathedral of fine dining, featuring crystal chandeliers, velvet booths, and hushed conversations among Manhattan's elite. Derek had begged his senior partner Richard to join us for dinner to discuss an upcoming promotion. However, Derek had also invited Peyton. Peyton was 26 years old, held a junior position at their firm, and proudly wore the title of Derek's workwife. Throughout appetizers, she sat inappropriately close to my husband, brushing his forearm while laughing too loudly at every mediocre joke. I sat rigidly across from them, maintaining a polite smile, while Richard looked visibly uncomfortable with their unprofessional dynamic. When it was time to select the main courses and the wine pairing, I reached across the white tablecloth for the heavy leather wine list. Before my fingers could even brush the cover, Derek aggressively snatched it away, pulling it out of my reach. The sudden movement caught the attention of the tables nearest to us. He leaned into my space, his expression twisting into a condescending sneer. "Try not to embarrass me tonight, Maddie," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom, but kept low enough so Richard would not hear. "Just smile, eat your food, and keep your mouth shut. You are a farm girl from upstate. Do not sit here and pretend you know what a truffle is, let alone a vintage wine. Let the adults handle this." I froze, the sheer cruelty of his words vibrating through my chest. Peyton, who had leaned in just close enough to hear his vicious little warning, covered her mouth to hide a suppressed, mocking giggle. She looked at me with eyes full of pure pity and triumph, completely buying into Derek's narrative that I was an uncultured burden dragging down his high-flying city life. I did not argue. I simply folded my hands in my lap and watched. Derek aggressively motioned for our waiter, an older, dignified Italian man named Lorenzo, who approached our table with impeccable posture. Determined to show off his imaginary sophistication to Richard and Peyton, Derek decided to order for the entire table in Italian. What followed was an absolute massacre of the language. He loudly rattled off menu items with a horrifying, offensive, and inaccurate accent. He mispronounced the names of the dishes so badly that the words lost all meaning, sounding more like a mockery of the culture than an actual food order. Peyton continued to giggle, clearly thinking Derek was being incredibly charming. Lorenzo stood perfectly still, his brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. The waiter politely asked Derek to repeat the order or simply point to the items on the English side of the menu. Derek's face flushed an ugly, angry red. His fragile ego shattered the moment he felt challenged. He slammed his hand on the table, causing the silverware to rattle, and began to yell at the authentic Italian waiter. He loudly accused Lorenzo of utter incompetence, demanding to know how a luxury establishment could hire someone who could not understand a basic order. The dining room grew dead silent, every eye locked on my husband's humiliating tantrum. Richard looked mortified, rubbing his temples in absolute despair. I took a slow, measured breath. The time for shrinking myself was over. I unclasped my hands and prepared to step in. I slowly raised my right hand, a subtle but incredibly firm gesture that instantly caught Lorenzo's attentive eye. Before Derek could launch into another humiliating, aggressive tirade against the bewildered waiter, I finally spoke. The words flowed from my lips in flawless, rapid regional Italian. I offered a sincere, elegant apology to Lorenzo for my husband's complete lack of decorum. Then, without even glancing at the heavy leather menu Derek had snatched away from me, I effortlessly ordered for the entire table. I selected the salt-baked branzino for Richard, the delicate veal reduction for Peyton, and the braised osso buco for Derek. To perfectly anchor the meal, I requested a rare bottle from their hidden reserve cellar. I specifically asked for a $4,000 vintage Amarone, noting the precise Tuscan slope the grapes hailed from and the exact year of the harvest. The heavy silence that crashed over our table was absolute. Lorenzo's posture instantly shifted from defensive tension to deep, unmistakable respect. His eyes lit up with genuine appreciation for a patron who truly understood the menu. He offered a slight formal bow, murmuring his highest compliments on my impeccable pronunciation and my extraordinary, highly educated wine selection. With a crisp nod, he pivoted swiftly toward the kitchen to execute the order. Derek sat completely frozen in his expensive chair. His mouth hung slightly open, his face quickly draining of color before flooding with a violent, unadulterated red rage. The entire power dynamic at the table had inverted in the span of 30 seconds. Richard leaned forward, abandoning his previous polite discomfort. His eyes were suddenly bright with eager fascination, captivated by my unexpected command of the situation. Richard shifted his chair, ignoring Derek, treating him as though he were entirely invisible. He asked me directly where I had acquired such a profound, specialized knowledge of Italian culinary regionalism and advanced viticulture. I calmly engaged him, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. I watched the thick blue vein in Derek's neck throb dangerously as he realized his senior partner was entirely enamored with the exact woman he had just ordered to remain silent and obedient. Derek had spent weeks begging for this dinner to secure a promotion, and now he was reduced to a silent background extra in his own performative networking event. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the edge of the pristine tablecloth. He hated nothing more than a woman who refused to stay in her designated shadow, and I was currently shining brilliantly. Sensing Derek's spiraling internal panic and desperately eager to reclaim her position as the most captivating woman at the table, Peyton decided to launch a hostile rescue mission. She leaned across the table, her cocktail dress slipping dangerously low, and sneered at me with narrowed, judgmental eyes. She loudly asked if I had learned that fake, exaggerated accent from a cheap language app on my phone. She let out a mocking laugh, looking directly at Richard to invite him in on the cruel joke, but the senior partner remained absolutely stone-faced. I did not break eye contact with her. A razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I calmly replied that no, Peyton, I did not use a language app. I informed her that I learned the dialect by spending my childhood summers assessing generational vineyards in Tuscany. I watched the uncomfortable realization wash over Peyton's heavily contoured face. I was not the uneducated, pathetic, naive country bumpkin they had spent the entire evening mocking behind their wine glasses. I was holding court with absolute, undeniable authority. Derek could not stomach my victory for a single second longer. If he could not intellectually or verbally control the conversation, he would physically destroy the scene entirely to regain his dominance. His heavy hand shot out across the white tablecloth in a swift, violent, calculated motion. He deliberately struck his full, sweating glass of ice water. The crystal tipped violently forward, sending a freezing cascade of water and jagged ice cubes directly into my lap. The liquid soaked instantly through the expensive fabric of my silk dress, pasting the material uncomfortably to my skin in a blatant attempt to physically humiliate me and force me to retreat from the table in absolute shame. He expected me to scream, to jump up in shock, to run crying toward the restroom like a humiliated child. That was the reaction his fragile pride desperately needed to reassert his control over the situation. Instead, I remained perfectly seated. I slowly picked up my pristine white linen napkin and deliberately dabbed at the freezing water on my dress with unshaken, terrifying composure. I looked directly into his panicking, desperate eyes, leaned forward just slightly over the ruined silk, and smiled a cold, victorious smile. The rest of the dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of suffocating tension for my husband and his mistress, but absolute triumph for me. Richard continued to engage me in a lively discussion about the subtle nuances of European agricultural imports, completely ignoring Derek's pathetic attempts to steer the conversation back to his logistics pitch. Peyton sat in sullen silence, aggressively pushing her veal around her plate. She occasionally shot venomous glares at my damp silk dress, but her previous arrogance had entirely evaporated. Derek was practically vibrating with unreleased anger trapped in a polite social setting where any further outburst would guarantee the immediate destruction of his career. I enjoyed every bite of my meal, savoring the rich flavors and the shift in power. When the plates were finally cleared, Lorenzo glided back to our table holding a sleek black leather folder. He placed it discreetly in the center of the table. The damage for the evening, fueled primarily by the rare vintage Amarone I had selected, totaled nearly $6,000. Derek saw his opportunity for retaliation. His eyes darted to the astronomical final number, and a cruel, calculating smirk spread across his face. He knew exactly how much money was in the joint checking account he strictly controlled. He kept me on a humiliatingly tight allowance, depositing barely $500 a month for personal expenses. He believed he had me completely trapped. With a swift, aggressive motion, Derek grabbed the leather folder and slid it directly across the white tablecloth until it hit my plate. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with arrogant satisfaction. "Since you wanted to show off with that wine tonight, country girl, you can cover the dinner," he announced. His voice was loud enough for Richard to hear, framing me as an irresponsible spendthrift, while simultaneously attempting to embarrass me financially. Peyton let out a sharp, triumphant laugh, her eyes lighting up as she anticipated my public humiliation. Derek watched me with hungry, malicious expectation, waiting for me to stammer to apologize, to beg him to use his corporate card to save face. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with him. My expression remained a mask of absolute freezing calm. I slowly reached into my vintage leather purse and bypassed the cheap plastic debit card tied to our joint account. Instead, my fingers found the cool, heavy titanium I had kept hidden for the entire duration of our marriage. I pulled out a solid metal American Express Centurion black card. I placed it onto the leather folder with a distinct heavy thud that echoed over the table. Peyton leaned over to inspect the card, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. She scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Is that a prepaid debit card from a grocery store?" She sneered, desperate to maintain the narrative that I was a broke rural nobody. "Real luxury cards do not look like chunks of industrial metal. You are going to get his card declined and embarrass him again." Lorenzo, however, recognized the exclusive invitation-only card immediately. His posture straightened further as he picked up the folder with extreme reverence. He did not ask a single question. He simply nodded deeply to me and turned toward the payment terminal. Derek stared at the empty space on the table where the card had been, his mind scrambling to process what he had just witnessed. He knew I had no income. He knew my bank balance. He opened his mouth to interrogate me, but Richard interrupted, completely oblivious to the financial warfare happening across the table. Richard raised his glass one final time. "Maddie, this has been an absolutely incredible evening," he said warmly. "Your expertise is unmatched. I cannot thank you enough for ordering that phenomenal vintage. It is rare to meet someone with such refined, authentic taste." Lorenzo returned instantly, carrying the approved receipt on a polished silver tray. There were no embarrassing security holds, no declined messages, and no frantic calls to the bank. He placed the elegant silver pen beside my hand with immense, undisguised respect. Peyton stared at the receipt in absolute terrified shock, her jaw practically unhinged as she calculated the impossibly high sum. Derek was left completely reeling, his face drained of all color, as he stared at me in horrified confusion. I picked up the heavy silver pen and signed the $6,000 receipt with perfect, unshaken composure, adding a generous $1,000 tip for Lorenzo. I closed the luxurious leather folder with a soft snap, stood up smoothly from the table, despite my clinging damp dress, and looked down at my husband. He opened and closed his mouth, entirely speechless. The absolute illusion of his pathetic control was officially shattered. We walked out of Il Cielo under the warm glow of the street lamps. Richard shook my hand with genuine warmth, thanking me once more before his driver pulled away. Peyton practically sprinted in the opposite direction, her face still flushed with deep humiliation. Derek maintained a stiff, terrifyingly fake smile until Richard's taillights disappeared around the corner. The absolute second the heavy doors of our waiting town car slammed shut, his polite corporate persona completely evaporated. The confined space of the back seat instantly transformed into a suffocating pressure cooker. Derek erupted. He slammed his fists against the leather partition, his voice a vicious echoing snarl that filled the dark cabin. He demanded to know what kind of twisted game I thought I was playing. He viciously berated me, screaming that I had deliberately tried to emasculate him and make him look like a broke fool in front of the single most important man in his company. His face twisted into a mask of pure rage as he accused me of intentionally sabotaging his career to feed my pathetic ego. He demanded to know exactly how I had managed to acquire an invitation-only titanium credit card. His eyes narrowed with paranoid suspicion as he accused me of secretly opening massive lines of credit behind his back. He screamed I was plunging our household into inescapable debt just to show off for a waiter and his mistress. I sat perfectly still against the plush leather seat, ignoring his spit flying through the air. My damp silk dress clung uncomfortably to my skin, a freezing reminder of his physical aggression. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming pitch. I simply turned my head, looked him dead in the eyes, and calmly stated the absolute truth. I told him the card was completely paid off. I explained it was a corporate account tied directly to my family's estate, an emergency line of credit I had held since I turned 18. Derek stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds before throwing his head back and letting out a harsh, hysterical laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of humor, dripping instead with vicious poison. He clapped his hands together in mock applause, viciously mocking what he called my pathetic delusions of grandeur. He leaned into my space, his breath smelling of the expensive wine I had just paid for, and aggressively reminded me of my place. He called me a delusional farm girl playing dress-up. He laughed at the very idea that my family's dirty, rundown farm in upstate New York could ever qualify for a luxury financial asset. He accused me of being a compulsive liar, insisting I was living in a complete fantasy world to cope with my own inadequacy. When I refused to break down or argue back, his tone shifted from mocking to dangerously threatening. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He promised that the second the banks opened tomorrow morning, he was going to completely freeze every single joint account we shared. He declared he was going to cut off my pathetic allowance, cancel my debit cards, and strip away my access to basic household funds. He looked at me with undisguised malice, vowing to teach me financial respect and absolute obedience. He wanted to ensure I would never dare step out of my designated shadow again, forcing me to beg him for grocery money by noon. I turned my gaze away from his red, sweating face and stared out the tinted window at the passing city lights. I did not offer a single word of defense or waste my breath trying to convince him of a reality he was far too arrogant to comprehend. In that quiet, suffocating darkness, the last remaining thread of my marital loyalty snapped. I realized with absolute freezing clarity that my husband was not just deeply insecure or misguided. He was actively, intentionally malicious. He thrived on my perceived weakness and drew his strength from my subjugation. I watched the glowing skyline reflect in the glass, my mind calculating my next steps with ruthless precision. I felt no fear regarding his empty financial threats. The man plotting to cut off my $500 allowance had no idea he was declaring war on a woman who could buy his entire firm before breakfast. The town car pulled to a smooth stop in front of our luxury apartment building. Derek practically shoved me aside to get out first, eager to continue his tirade upstairs. I stepped into the cool night air, carefully smoothing my ruined dress. I took a slow, measured breath, prepared for the conflict to roll seamlessly into the next massive hurdle I knew was waiting for me the second I opened our front door. I unlocked the front door of our luxury apartment, stepping into the dimly lit foyer with Derek storming closely behind me, his anger radiating like heat. Before I could even take off my coat, the harsh glare of the living room lamps hit my eyes. Sitting dead center on our custom white velvet sofa, holding a crystal glass of my expensive imported sparkling water, was Barbara. Derek's toxic mother had used the spare key I had explicitly forbidden him from giving her. She did not even bother to stand or offer a basic greeting as we walked in. Her sharp, highly critical eyes immediately scanned my body from head to toe, lingering with obvious disgust on my damp, clinging silk dress. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh, swirling the water in her expensive glass. She loudly proclaimed that my dress looked incredibly cheap, horribly tailored, and entirely inappropriate for a high-stakes corporate dinner with executives. She accused me of deliberately trying to make her brilliant son look like he had married a bargain bin charity case to humiliate their family name. She sneered that true elegance could never be taught to someone raised on upstate dirt, a deeply ironic statement, coming from a woman currently wearing head-to-toe counterfeit designer labels she bought online. I stood silently in the entryway, refusing to give her the explosive emotional reaction she was so clearly fishing for. Derek immediately threw himself onto the sofa next to her, transforming instantly from a terrifying tyrant in the car into a whining, victimized child seeking comfort. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at me and launched into a frantic, highly exaggerated retelling of the restaurant incident. He practically yelled that I had deliberately and publicly emasculated him in front of his senior partner. He aggressively complained about my complete financial disrespect, detailing how I had slapped a heavy metal black credit card onto the table to cover a $6,000 dinner bill just to ruin his carefully curated image of total control. He completely omitted the crucial part where he had aggressively forced the leather bill folder onto my plate, painting himself entirely as the innocent victim of my malicious, unprovoked financial sabotage. Barbara gasped loudly, pressing a heavily manicured hand to her chest in a ridiculous display of perfectly rehearsed fake horror. She looked at me as though I had just committed a violent crime right in her pristine living room. She loudly declared that my behavior was financially reckless, wildly disrespectful, and a clear sign that I was mentally unstable. She turned to Derek, patting his arm affectionately, and cooed that he was far too lenient with my rebellious behavior. She insisted that my blatant insubordination required immediate, strict legal intervention before I dragged his bright corporate future into the filthy gutter. With a swift, aggressive motion, Barbara unclasped her oversized designer purse. She reached deep inside and pulled out a thick, firmly bound stack of legal documents, slamming them down onto the delicate glass coffee table with a heavy, threatening thud. She then pulled out a heavy gold-plated pen and slammed it down right next to the paperwork. I looked down at the bold, capitalized letters printed across the top page. It was a comprehensive, highly restrictive post-nuptial agreement. Barbara crossed her arms defensively and ordered me to step forward and sign the document immediately without reading the details. She puffed out her chest loudly, boasting that Derek was on the verge of landing a massive life-changing logistics contract with Vanguard Logistics next week. She arrogantly claimed that this upcoming deal would instantly catapult her son into the highest upper echelon of corporate wealth, and they needed to urgently protect his impending millions from a scheming, desperate gold digger like me. She looked me dead in the eyes and snarled that she always knew a broke country farm girl would eventually try to sink her filthy claws into her son's hard-earned empire. She demanded I legally surrender any future right to his incoming corporate income, his expanding investments, his retirement accounts, and the very luxury apartment we were currently standing in. Derek sat closely beside her, nodding vigorously, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride as his mother fought his battles for him. They looked at me with smug, victorious expectation, genuinely believing they had completely cornered me in my own home. They thought this post-nuptial agreement was an ironclad trap designed to strip me of absolutely everything. They had absolutely no idea that Vanguard Logistics was owned by my younger brother. They had no idea that this exact legal document they were trying to force upon me was about to become the very weapon I would expertly use to orchestrate their absolute spectacular total destruction. I looked down at the gold-plated pen resting on top of the aggressively thick stack of legal documents. I did not reach for it. Instead, I crossed my arms over my chest and looked directly at Barbara, then at my husband. I told them with absolute, unwavering clarity that I was not signing a single page of their ridiculous, legally absurd postnuptial agreement. The immediate reaction was instantaneous and highly explosive. Derek leaped up from the white velvet sofa, his face contorting into a mask of furious indignation. He began screaming that I was an ungrateful, manipulative gold digger who was actively trying to ruin his entire life. Barbara immediately joined the verbal assault, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings of our apartment. She shrieked that I was a low-class opportunist trying to steal her son's corporate empire. They cornered me near the coffee table, launching a vicious tirade designed to force my compliance. I stood my ground, refusing to flinch as their insults grew increasingly unhinged and desperate. As they continued to scream their baseless accusations, a sudden sharp chime cut through the chaotic noise. The bright screen of Derek's iPad, sitting directly in the center of the glass coffee table, illuminated the dark room. Derek had carelessly left his messaging app synced across all his devices. A notification banner expanded across the large glaring screen in massive, unmissable text. The message was from Peyton. The words glowed brightly for all three of us to clearly see. "Did you get the farm girl to sign the postnup? Cannot wait to celebrate our Vanguard deal in Paris, babe." The screaming stopped instantly. The sudden suffocating silence that crashed down over the living room was deafening. The air in the apartment grew completely stagnant as the absolute reality of the glowing screen set in. Derek stared at the iPad, the blood rapidly draining from his face, until he looked like a terrified ghost. His jaw dropped open, his eyes darting frantically between the incriminating message and my face. Barbara froze her mouth, forming a silent shape of horror, as she realized her son's sordid affair had just been exposed right in the middle of her legal ambush. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not demand an explanation or throw myself onto the floor in hysterics. I simply looked at the glowing text message, then shifted my gaze to my husband's panicked, sweating face. His betrayal was not a shock. It was merely the final piece of the puzzle falling perfectly into place. Without uttering a single word, I turned my back on both of them and walked calmly down the hallway toward the master bedroom. My mind was completely clear, functioning with cold, calculating precision. I walked into my expansive closet and bypassed the cheap luggage Derek had bought for me. Instead, I pulled down a single vintage leather weekender bag I had inherited from my grandfather. I methodically packed a few essential items of clothing, my luxury toiletries, and my personal identification documents. I did not rush. I folded my garments with deliberate care, entirely unfazed by the muffled, frantic whispering coming from the living room. Derek appeared in the bedroom doorway just as I zipped the leather bag closed. He was sweating profusely, shifting his weight from foot to foot, desperately trying to regain control of a situation that had completely slipped through his fingers. He let out a loud, nervous laugh that echoed poorly against the bedroom walls. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project a terrifying authority he no longer possessed. "Walk out that door and you have nothing!" He shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of his own panic. "You will be begging on the streets by tomorrow morning. I am the one with the money. I am the one with the Vanguard contract. If you leave now, you leave with the clothes on your back." I slung the heavy leather strap over my shoulder and walked straight toward him. He instinctively took a step back, shrinking away from my unbroken eye contact. I walked past him down the hallway and re-entered the living room. Barbara was still standing perfectly still, clutching her counterfeit designer purse like a protective shield. I stopped at the glass coffee table. I looked down at the unsigned postnuptial agreement Barbara had demanded I sign to protect Derek's imaginary wealth. I slowly slid my diamond wedding ring off my left hand. I placed the sparkling heavy ring directly on top of the signature line of the legal document. The sharp, metallic clink sounded exactly like a final gavel strike. I turned around, walked out the front door, and left them standing in the absolute ruins of their own arrogance. I stepped out of the luxury apartment building and inhaled the crisp night air. The heavy weight of the past 5 years had instantly vanished from my shoulders. I did not hail a standard taxi. I opened my phone and arranged for a private black car to take me directly to the Four Seasons. The drive through the city felt incredibly freeing. I watched the streetlights blur past the tinted windows, my mind operating with absolute clarity. When I arrived at the grand entrance, the concierge greeted me with impeccable service. I bypassed the standard rooms and immediately booked their top-tier penthouse suite. I handed over my heavy black Centurion card without a second thought. The elevator ride to the highest floor was completely silent, a stark contrast to the aggressive screaming match I had just left behind. I walked into the sprawling, opulent suite and dropped my vintage leather weekender bag onto the polished marble floor. I walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering city skyline that my husband falsely claimed to conquer. Then I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and made a single phone call. I only had to say 3 words. I need you. Exactly 30 minutes later, I watched from my aerial vantage point as a sleek, jet-black Maybach glided smoothly into the hotel's private drop-off lane. The vehicle practically radiated authority. Moments later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet penthouse. I opened the heavy double doors. Standing in the hallway was my younger brother, Weston. At 31 years old, he carried the unmistakable, terrifyingly calm aura of a self-made billionaire. He was the undisputed CEO of Vanguard Logistics, the exact company my soon-to-be ex-husband was currently begging for a contract from. Weston did not come alone. Standing right beside him, radiating absolute power in a razor-sharp, tailored designer suit, was his wife, Jasmine. At 32, Jasmine was a brilliant, ruthless African-American corporate attorney. She served as the chief legal officer for Vanguard Logistics, and she was the sharpest, most lethal weapon in our family's entire corporate arsenal. She carried a sleek, heavy leather briefcase looking less like a supportive family member and more like an executioner arriving for a scheduled appointment. Weston pulled me into a fierce, protective embrace. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply looked at my face, read the quiet, unyielding determination in my eyes, and nodded with grim understanding. Jasmine hugged me next, her expression shifting instantly from familial warmth to a highly calculated legal assessment. We moved to the expansive velvet seating area in the center of the penthouse. I ordered a round of vintage bourbon from room service, deciding I was officially done playing the role of the compliant, thrifty housewife. I did not waste time with tearful, emotional exposition. I unlocked my phone, took a slow sip of my bourbon, and slid the device across the glass coffee table directly toward them. On the screen was the high-resolution photograph I had snapped of the unsigned post-nuptial agreement Barbara had aggressively tried to force upon me just an hour ago. I swiped to the next image, displaying the intercepted text message from Peyton, bragging about celebrating their Vanguard deal in Paris. Weston leaned forward and stared down at the brightly illuminated screen. His jaw tightened immediately, the muscles ticking dangerously as he processed the sheer audacity of my husband's betrayal. He looked absolutely ready to tear the entire city apart with his bare hands to avenge my honor. Jasmine, however, picked up the phone with cool, terrifying precision. She zoomed in on the legal jargon of the post-nuptial document, her dark, intelligent eyes rapidly scanning the poorly drafted clauses and restrictive financial demands. A slow, chilling smile spread across her flawless face. Then she let out a sharp, cold laugh that echoed through the quiet luxury of the penthouse. She tossed the phone back onto the glass table with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "This is certainly cute," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. "He wants to protect his non-existent wealth from the sole heir of a $400 million vineyard syndicate." I leaned back against the plush sofa cushions, a matching cold smile forming on my lips. Derek genuinely believed he was a high-powered corporate titan safeguarding his imaginary millions from a clueless country girl. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed Vanguard's chief legal officer the exact roadmap she needed to completely dismantle his entire existence. The deeply arrogant fool actually thought he held all the winning cards, completely unaware that he had just invited the casino owners to sit directly at his table. Jasmine did not waste another single second of our highly valuable time. She unlatched her heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek silver laptop, placing it squarely on the glass coffee table alongside our bourbon glasses. As the chief legal officer for a global logistics empire, she possessed access to forensic financial databases that standard civilian lawyers could only dream of utilizing. Her perfectly manicured fingers flew across the keyboard with terrifying speed, bypassing basic security protocols to run a highly intrusive high-level background check on my husband. I watched the glowing screen reflect in her dark eyes as she dug directly into Derek's corporate filings and the joint banking infrastructure he had strictly controlled throughout our entire marriage. He had always claimed our finances were exceptionally tight, forcing me to live on a humiliatingly small allowance while he allegedly reinvested his massive corporate bonuses into high-yield corporate bonds. Jasmine pulled up the routing numbers and began tracing the hidden digital footprint of his outgoing transactions. Within exactly 10 minutes, she had completely and effortlessly bypassed his amateur digital smokescreen. She let out a sharp, disgusted breath and turned the laptop screen toward Weston and me. The spreadsheet displayed a series of massive recurring wire transfers, systematically siphoning money directly from our primary household savings account. Derek had not been investing his bonuses or building a secure nest egg for our future family. He had been actively embezzling our shared marital assets and funneling the capital into a newly registered private consulting limited liability company. Jasmine tapped the trackpad, pulling up the state registry documents for the shadowy corporate entity. The sole proprietor holding 100% of the executive shares was Peyton. My husband had been legally stealing my money to fund a fraudulent shell corporation owned entirely by his 26-year-old mistress. Jasmine explained that Derek was likely using the fake consulting firm to launder his bonuses and hide his liquid assets in preparation for a divorce. He falsely believed he could leave me completely destitute while he walked away financially unscathed. His absolute arrogance had blinded him to the fact that his sloppy financial crimes were leaving a blazing, undeniable paper trail of federal fraud. Weston slammed his crystal glass down onto the table with enough force to crack the thick glass. His face hardened into a mask of pure protective rage. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit jacket, his thumb hovering fiercely over his exclusive contacts list. He declared he was going to call Richard right now. He wanted to completely destroy Derek's career with a single devastating phone call, ensuring my husband was fired, blacklisted, and escorted out of his office building by corporate security before midnight. He wanted to burn Derek's professional reputation to ashes instantly. I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over Weston's phone, pushing it down against the glass. I looked into my brother's furious eyes and shook my head. No, I told him, keeping my voice dangerously calm. He looked me dead in the face tonight and told me I was just a clueless country girl who embarrassed him. He went out of his way to humiliate me in front of his peers. I do not want him destroyed behind closed doors in a private phone call. I want to embarrass him on his own stage. I turned to my brother with a cold, calculating smile. When is his big presentation to your company, Wes? Weston slowly lowered his phone, the fierce anger in his eyes morphing into a sharp, predatory smirk. He leaned back against the plush velvet sofa, fully understanding the lethal precision of my specific request. Next Friday, at exactly 10 in the morning, he answered, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous register. Derek and Richard are coming directly to the Vanguard headquarters to deliver their final logistics pitch to my executive board. He genuinely thinks he is about to secure the most lucrative contract of his pathetic life. Jasmine smiled brightly, her brilliant legal mind already running a dozen steps ahead of the situation. She pulled her laptop closer, cracking her knuckles with aggressive, joyful anticipation. The three of us spent the next 4 hours sitting in that luxurious penthouse, fueled by expensive bourbon and righteous vengeance. We meticulously plotted the exact flawless architecture of Derek's total corporate and financial annihilation. Jasmine outlined the precise legal traps she would secretly spring, while Weston mapped out the boardroom seating arrangements to maximize my husband's public humiliation. Derek thought he had successfully buried a weak, defenseless farm girl. He had absolutely no idea he had just triggered a calculated, highly orchestrated corporate execution. And I was going to be the only one holding the heavy, unforgiving executioner's axe. While we meticulously planned his absolute destruction from the towering heights of the Four Seasons penthouse, Derek was busy celebrating his perceived victory across the city. The very next morning, he officially moved Peyton into our luxury apartment. She arrived with 3 oversized suitcases, immediately claiming my former closet space and loudly declaring that the apartment finally had a woman who understood true metropolitan sophistication. Derek felt like an undisputed king. He genuinely believed he had masterfully discarded an uneducated farm girl without suffering a consequence. He proudly poured expensive champagne into our crystal glasses, toasting with his mistress to their bright impending future. In his arrogant mind, my quiet departure was the ultimate proof of my absolute weakness. He thought I was currently weeping in some cheap motel, desperately regretting my refusal to sign his oppressive post-nuptial agreement. He strutted around the apartment, eager to showcase his newly liberated status to the corporate world. Unable to contain his inflated ego, Derek pulled out his smartphone to broadcast his triumph. He snapped a highly staged, pretentious photograph of himself standing on the apartment balcony, wearing a custom-tailored suit, while gazing thoughtfully out over the Manhattan skyline. Peyton's manicured hand rested visibly on his shoulder, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light. He posted the image across all his professional and personal social media networks. The caption was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. He bragged about the immense value of cutting toxic dead weight from his personal life to achieve ultimate professional clarity. He boldly declared he was currently preparing for the single biggest logistics pitch of his entire career, publicly tagging Vanguard Logistics and expressing his intense excitement to finally meet his corporate idol, the visionary CEO Weston. He sat back on the white velvet sofa, greedily watching likes roll in from his sycophantic colleagues. He was flying dangerously close to the sun. Miles away, Jasmine was already executing the first silent, lethal phase of our retaliatory strike. Operating with the ruthless efficiency of a top-tier corporate attorney, she utilized the detailed financial data we had uncovered regarding Peyton's fraudulent consulting firm. Jasmine discreetly contacted the executive fraud department of the bank that managed our shared household wealth. Posing as my official legal counsel, she presented undeniable, highly documented evidence of suspicious, unauthorized wire transfers draining marital assets into an unverified third-party shell corporation. The bank's automated security protocols triggered instantly. Within a matter of hours, a hard, impenetrable digital padlock was slammed down on every single joint, checking and savings account Derek possessed. His access to the primary banking infrastructure was completely and irrevocably frozen pending a comprehensive federal fraud investigation. Jasmine smiled as the confirmation email landed in her inbox. She had successfully severed his main financial artery without making a sound. Derek discovered the sudden financial freeze later that afternoon while trying to order a celebratory lunch. The debit card was swiftly declined. Rather than recognizing the severe legal danger he was in, his overwhelming arrogance led him to a completely different, entirely incorrect conclusion. He simply laughed, assuming I had thrown a petty, vindictive tantrum and reported my own card stolen to temporarily inconvenience him. He genuinely believed it was a minor, pathetic administrative glitch that he could easily resolve after he secured his massive contract on Friday. He was far too preoccupied with rehearsing his stolen supply chain presentation to spend hours waiting on hold with the bank's fraud department. He tossed the useless debit card onto the kitchen counter, utterly unbothered. He figured he would just let the bank sort out my supposed hysterical overreaction while he focused on impressing the Vanguard executives and cementing his corporate status. Peyton, completely ignorant to the financial guillotine suspended over their heads, demanded they go on a massive shopping spree. She insisted she needed a new expensive wardrobe to celebrate their upcoming victory trip to Paris. Eager to maintain his facade of limitless wealth and appease his demanding mistress, Derek gladly obliged. Since his primary bank accounts were locked, he foolishly turned to his secondary financial reserves. He pulled out a stack of personal and corporate credit cards, all carrying notoriously high predatory interest rates. They paraded through the high-end boutiques of Fifth Avenue, swiping the plastic with reckless abandon. Derek eagerly signed for designer handbags, tailored cocktail dresses, and expensive jewelry, rapidly maxing out his available credit limits. He was intentionally plunging himself into massive, inescapable debt, convinced that his impending Vanguard bonus would easily cover the exorbitant luxury purchases. He walked out of the final boutique carrying armfuls of shopping bags, oblivious to the devastating reality that the trap had already snapped shut. Early the next morning, my phone vibrated with a secure location pin sent directly from Jasmine. She summoned me to the towering glass and steel headquarters of Vanguard Logistics, a monolithic structure that dominated the downtown financial district. I bypassed the standard visitor checkpoints, guided by a private security detail that escorted me straight to the dedicated executive elevator. The doors opened onto the highest floor, revealing a sprawling panoramic boardroom wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass. Jasmine was already seated at the head of the massive mahogany table, surrounded by glowing monitors and thick stacks of pristine legal documents. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield, completely in her element. I took a seat beside her, marveling at the quiet, terrifying efficiency of her workspace. Jasmine slid a heavily redacted file toward me. She explained that she had spent the entire night meticulously drafting my official divorce petition. She did not use standard boilerplate legal templates. Instead, she had taken the exact highly restrictive postnuptial agreement Barbara had aggressively tried to force upon me and weaponized its core language against my husband. Derek had demanded absolute separation of assets to protect his impending corporate bonuses from me. Jasmine flipped his greedy, paranoid verbiage entirely upside down. She legally severed Derek from any potential claim to my family's generational vineyard empire, my hidden trust funds, and my substantial investment portfolios. By strictly honoring his aggressive demand for total financial independence, he was now legally blocked from touching a single cent of the staggering wealth he never knew I possessed. Furthermore, Jasmine had expertly folded in the devastating civil lawsuit, demanding total restitution for the funds he had actively embezzled to finance Peyton's fraudulent consulting firm. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting beside the documents and signed my name with sharp, unwavering strokes. The legal web was now flawlessly spun, waiting for him to blindly stumble into it. With the paperwork finalized and safely locked in her briefcase, Jasmine slammed her laptop shut. She looked at my simple, understated clothing with a critical, appraising eye. For 5 years, I had deliberately toned myself down. I had worn modest sweaters, muted colors, and unbranded shoes simply to make Derek feel like the superior provider. I had actively hidden my natural elegance to protect his incredibly fragile ego. Jasmine stood up, her sharp heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She declared that the compliant thrift store farm girl aesthetic was officially dead. It was time to physically embody the ruthless, unyielding power I currently held. We left the Vanguard Tower and stepped into a waiting private car, heading straight toward the most exclusive, terrifyingly expensive designer boutiques in the city. Jasmine did not allow me to browse the sales racks or look at price tags. She ushered me into a private VIP fitting room where a team of personal stylists brought out garments reserved only for elite clients. I stood in front of the massive gilded mirror and let the stylists work. I discarded the plain, unremarkable clothing that had defined my suffocating marriage. Jasmine selected a stunning razor-sharp tailored power suit. The fabric was a deep, rich emerald green that perfectly complemented my complexion, woven from the finest Italian silk and wool blend. The cut was exceptionally aggressive, featuring sharp, structured shoulders and a sleek, tapered waist that commanded absolute authority. I slipped into the suit and paired it with the pristine, crisp, white silk blouse. The transformation was immediate and breathtaking. I stepped into a pair of towering black leather stiletto heels that echoed with dangerous confidence. The stylists pulled my hair back into a sleek, sophisticated style, highlighting the sharp angles of my cheekbones, and applied a bold, striking red lipstick that radiated pure, unfiltered power. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. The timid, accommodating wife, who had quietly endured years of financial abuse and verbal degradation, was completely gone. Staring back was the sole heiress to a $400 million syndicate. Staring back was a woman who had just legally trapped her cheating husband in an inescapable financial nightmare. Jasmine stood behind me, nodding with deep, genuine approval. She rested her hands on my structured shoulders and smiled her lethal corporate smile. She told me I looked like a woman who was about to casually destroy a man's entire life before her lunch break. I adjusted the lapel of my incredibly expensive jacket, feeling the heavy, cool fabric armor my body. The country girl was dead. The heiress was fully activated, flawlessly dressed, and absolutely ready for war. We stepped out of the luxury boutique, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind us. I adjusted my designer sunglasses. Ready for absolute corporate warfare, Friday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving clarity of a looming execution. At precisely 9:45, Derek pushed through the massive revolving glass doors of Vanguard Logistics headquarters. He walked into the cavernous, sunlit lobby as if he already owned the entire skyscraper. Despite his forced, arrogant swagger, physical signs of his underlying panic were glaringly obvious. A thin sheen of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead, and he repeatedly tugged at the collar of his expensive but poorly fitted suit. He was carrying my stolen supply chain presentation in a sleek leather portfolio, convinced of his absolute victory. Walking directly beside him, clinging possessively to his left arm, was Peyton. She had severely misjudged the professional environment of a billion-dollar logistics firm. She was dressed for a late-night club rather than a high-stakes 10 o'clock executive board meeting. She wore a tight, plunging black cocktail dress that drew sharp, disapproving glances from the polished corporate employees walking through the lobby. She tottered awkwardly on excessively high stiletto heels, looking less like a serious business consultant and more like a cheap accessory Derek had purchased to stroke his fragile ego. She giggled incredibly loudly, completely oblivious. Derek marched straight up to the sweeping marble reception desk. Instead of offering a polite greeting, he aggressively snapped his fingers at the head receptionist to demand her immediate attention. He loudly announced his name, puffing out his chest, and declaring that the CEO was eagerly expecting him for a top priority acquisition pitch. He spoke to the highly trained administrative staff as if they were incompetent servants, demanding they fetch him a sparkling water and alert the executive floor of his highly anticipated arrival. He had absolutely no idea that every single employee here had already been fully briefed. The receptionist maintained a mask of cold, flawless professional courtesy. She did not fetch his sparkling water. She simply pressed a silent button on her desk, summoned a quiet security escort, and directed Derek toward the private executive elevators with a chilling, perfectly rehearsed smile. The elevator ascended rapidly, launching them into the highest echelon of the Vanguard Tower. The heavy steel doors slid silently open, revealing the pristine, terrifyingly quiet executive floor. A polished assistant guided Derek and Peyton down a long, immaculate corridor, completely bypassing the standard meeting rooms and leading them toward a specialized area waiting today. They were led directly into a specialized glass-walled waiting room that overlooked the bustling financial district far below. The transparent walls were intentionally designed to make occupants feel entirely exposed, Yet Derek completely mistook the luxurious enclosure for an exclusive VIP holding pen. He threw his leather portfolio onto the glass table and began pacing the room with manic, overblown energy. He turned to Peyton, his voice booming loudly enough to echo through the transparent walls. He aggressively bragged about how he was going to completely dominate the upcoming presentation and secure the massive contract for his waiting company. He boasted that his supply chain strategy was a stroke of absolute genius, conveniently ignoring the undeniable fact that I had written every single metric and projection for him 2 years ago. He proudly declared that he was not just going to secure the logistics contract today. He told Peyton he planned to ruthlessly charm the CEO, leverage the sheer brilliance of the pitch, and aggressively demand an immediate promotion to executive vice president as a non-negotiable condition of the deal. He clapped his hands together, his delusion reaching astronomical heights, insisting they would be celebrating his massive upcoming victory. Peyton eagerly fed his massive ego. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing his cheek and cooing about how incredibly powerful he was. She loudly mocked me, laughing about how the clueless farm girl was probably crying in a cheap motel right now, completely missing out on his historic rise to the top. Derek smirked confidently, agreeing that cutting my dead weight was the best financial decision he had ever made. He straightened his tie, checked his reflection in the glass, and mentally prepared to conquer the corporate world, basking entirely in his own utterly fabricated sense of glory. He stood there, radiating obnoxious, unearned triumph, completely unaware that he was trapped in a highly sophisticated corporate terrarium. He did not notice the Vanguard security guards subtly positioning themselves near the exits. He did not realize the executive assistants were quietly watching him with expressions of profound pity. He genuinely believed he was the smartest, most powerful man in the building. He had absolutely no idea that the entire floor had already been flawlessly prepped, legally secured, and perfectly staged for his spectacular, devastating destruction. The trap was fully set, and he was walking right into the exact center. The heavy glass doors of the waiting room slid open with a soft mechanical hum. Derek spun around, expecting the CEO, but instead his senior partner Richard stepped inside. Richard had arrived separately and immediately glared at Peyton with profound, undisguised disapproval. He harshly questioned why a junior consultant was dressed for a nightclub at a morning pitch, but Derek smoothly waved off the concern. He confidently assured Richard that Peyton was a vital part of the presentation dynamic. Richard tightened his tie, far too nervous about the Vanguard contract to argue. A polished executive assistant appeared in the doorway. She informed them that the board was ready and instructed the trio to follow her. Derek aggressively straightened his jacket, threw his shoulders back, and led the charge. He strutted down the immaculate corridor with the blinding arrogance of a man who believed he was moments away from conquering the financial world. The assistant paused before a set of massive floor-to-ceiling frosted glass doors. She pressed her security badge to a scanner, and the heavy doors parted silently, revealing the absolute nerve center of global Vanguard logistics. The boardroom was an architectural masterpiece of modern corporate intimidation. It was cavernous, wrapped entirely in panoramic glass that offered a dizzying, spectacular, massive aerial view of the entire city skyline. Despite the morning sunlight pouring through the windows, the interior lighting was kept deliberately low, creating a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. A long, gleaming mahogany table stretched across the center of the room like a runway. Seated rigidly along both sides of the table were 7 highly respected top-tier Vanguard executives. They were cloaked in the shadows, their faces unreadable, their postures impossibly stiff. They did not stand to greet the entering guests. They did not offer polite smiles or standard corporate pleasantries. They simply sat in absolute, chilling silence, watching Derek walk into the room with the predatory focus of a pack of wolves observing a completely oblivious, terribly weak deer. Richard immediately sensed the terrifying shift in the atmosphere. He swallowed hard, his professional instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the dynamic of this meeting. He offered a polite, deferential nod to the shadowed executives, treading carefully. Peyton, entirely oblivious to the lethal corporate tension, clattered loudly across the hardwood floor on her stilettos, drawing disgusted looks from the Vanguard team. Derek, however, remained blinded by his own very inflated ego. He interpreted the deafening silence not as a warning, but as a sign of deep reverence for his impending genius. Derek confidently marched directly toward the presentation podium at the front of the room. He slammed his leather portfolio onto the polished wood and pulled out his laptop. He began loudly plugging in cables and syncing his device to the massive digital projector screen spanning the front wall. He aggressively cleared his throat, organizing his stolen notes and preparing his opening remarks with agonizing arrogance. He was so intensely focused on setting up his technological triumph that he completely failed to notice the most dangerous element in the entire room. Positioned at the very head of the long mahogany table, positioned dead center against the breathtaking panoramic view of the skyline, was a massive high-backed leather executive chair. The chair was turned completely away from the room, facing the glass. Only the very top of a sleek dark silhouette was visible over the tufted leather. Whoever was sitting in that throne of power remained absolutely motionless, completely ignoring the loud, chaotic noise of Derek setting up his presentation equipment. Richard noticed the turned chair and nervously wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. He desperately tried to catch Derek's eye to signal him to show some basic respect to the unseen executive, but Derek was entirely lost in his own delusions. He stood at the front of the room, puffing out his chest and flashing a predatory, overly confident grin at the silent executives in the shadows. He tapped the clicker in his hand, bringing the massive digital projector screen to life with the title slide of his stolen supply chain strategy. The tension in the air grew so thick and heavy it felt absolutely suffocating. The silence in the room was no longer just polite observation. It was a highly calculated, heavily armed trap waiting to be sprung without any prior warning. Derek took a deep breath, raised his arrogant chin, and prepared to deliver the absolute pitch of his life. He genuinely believed this was the exact moment he would finally become a legendary corporate titan. He was entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that the powerful woman sitting silently in the high-backed leather chair was about to completely turn his entire life into a smoking crater. Derek cleared his suddenly dry throat with a loud, incredibly aggressive cough that echoed sharply against the thick glass walls. He clicked the remote in his hand, advancing the massive digital screen to his opening title card. He began his presentation with a booming theatrical voice, instantly flooding the cavernous boardroom with a dizzying barrage of hollow corporate buzzwords. He aggressively paced back and forth in front of the massive projection, waving his arms and enthusiastically boasting about dynamic paradigm shifts, synergistic cross-platform integration, and disruptive global optimization. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man entirely insulated by his own massive ego. Richard offered a few tight, nervous nods from the sidelines, desperately hoping the Vanguard team was buying the performance. Peyton sat with her posture exaggerated, gazing up at Derek with naked, sycophantic adoration. The 7 Vanguard executives seated along the dark edges of the mahogany table, however, remained absolutely stoic. They did not take a single note. They did not offer a single nod of encouragement. They simply watched him perform his stolen routine with freezing, calculating indifference. Undeterred by the heavy, chilling silence, Derek confidently advanced his presentation to the core financial models. He puffed out his chest, placing a hand on his tailored suit jacket, and boldly declared that he was about to unveil an international supply chain strategy he had personally conceptualized. He bragged loudly about spending months conducting grueling high-level analytical research to personally engineer this highly complex architectural framework. It was a spectacular, breathtaking lie. The strategy displayed in bright lights on the massive screen was the exact highly detailed methodology I had painstakingly written for him 2 years ago. At the time, his previous firm was on the absolute verge of firing him for severe incompetence and failing performance reviews. I had stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights drinking black coffee and running predictive economic models just to save his fragile career. He had not even bothered to change the font or update the color scheme of my original graphs. He was standing in a billion-dollar boardroom proudly wearing a suit paid for by my credit, aggressively taking full credit for my intellect. Derek clicked the remote again, bringing up the heavily detailed fourth slide of the presentation. The screen illuminated a massive, intricate web of European logistical shipping nodes and projected cost reduction algorithms. He stepped directly into the projector light, pointing a triumphant finger at the chart. He loudly promised Vanguard an immediate aggressive reduction in overhead costs, guaranteeing an astronomical surge in their profit margins. He took a deep, arrogant breath and prepared to deliver his rehearsed closing argument for this section. He proudly announced that his unique, completely original methodology would guarantee a flawless, frictionless integration across all overseas sectors, entirely eliminating any potential fiscal bleed. He stood tall, completely immersed in the glorious high of his own fabricated brilliance. He never even got to finish his arrogant sentence. The heavy, smooth, mechanical whir of the high-backed leather executive chair suddenly cut through the quiet boardroom. The massive chair slowly and deliberately swiveled around to fully face the long mahogany table. I sat completely still, letting the dramatic movement command the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The pristine lighting of the boardroom caught the sharp, aggressive cut of my emerald green tailored power suit. I did not look like the compliant, terrified country girl he had abandoned in our apartment. I looked immaculate, unbreakable, and terrifyingly powerful. I slowly leaned forward against the polished wood, resting my elbows on the table, and perfectly folded my hands together. I locked my eyes directly onto my husband's stunned face. Your supply chain metrics on slide 4 are fundamentally flawed, Derek. My voice rang out through the massive glass room, cold and lethal, cutting through his thick cloud of corporate buzzwords like a freshly sharpened blade. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my tone echoed off the walls. I kept my gaze leveled entirely on him, watching the color completely drain from his sweating face as his brain violently short-circuited. You forgot to account for the European import tariffs, or did I not explain that clearly enough when I wrote this presentation for you? The question hung heavily in the freezing air of the executive boardroom, an undeniable catastrophic detonation of his entire professional facade. The complete, crushing silence that rushed back into the room was instantly deafening. I sat at the very head of the long table, an apex predator perfectly positioned in my domain, watching the sheer, unadulterated terror finally register in the wide, panicked eyes of the man who had foolishly thought he could ever possibly manage to conquer my entire world. Derek physically stumbled backward in absolute shock. The sudden retreat caused the heels of his expensive leather shoes to catch on the polished hardwood floor. He flailed his arms wildly to maintain his balance, and the presentation clicker slipped entirely from his sweating grip. It hit the ground with a sharp clatter that echoed loudly in the freezing silence of the massive boardroom. Over by the refreshment console, Peyton let out a loud theatrical gasp of pure horror. She clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between my emerald green power suit and Derek's rapidly crumbling facade. Richard, sitting rigidly at the edge of the mahogany table, looked completely horrified. His head snapped back and forth between me and his junior executive in pure, unadulterated confusion. He was witnessing a high-stakes corporate catastrophe unfold in real time, and he had no idea how to stop the heavy, catastrophic bleeding. Derek aggressively loosened his silk tie, his breathing becoming shallow and panicked. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me. He desperately demanded to know how his estranged, crazy wife had managed to sneak past the building's ground-floor security detail to maliciously sabotage his career-defining meeting. He turned toward the 7 shadowed Vanguard executives seated along the glass walls. He begged them to immediately call the building guards. He spun a frantic, desperate narrative shouting that I was a hysterical, bitter woman who was completely unable to accept the end of our marriage. He promised the silent executives that he would have me legally barred from the premises and formally arrested for corporate espionage. I did not move a single muscle to defend myself against his frantic, sweating accusations. I simply remained seated in my high-backed leather chair, my hands perfectly folded, allowing him to dig his own professional grave deeper with every single panicked word. Richard finally found his voice, demanding Derek explain why a woman he claimed was an uneducated farm girl had written the international supply chain strategy they were currently pitching to a billion-dollar logistics syndicate. Derek opened his mouth to formulate another frantic lie, but he never got the chance to speak. The heavy frosted glass side doors of the executive boardroom slid open with a smooth, commanding mechanical swoosh. Weston strode confidently into the room. My younger brother possessed a natural, terrifyingly calm authority that instantly commanded absolute submission from everyone in his presence. He was flawlessly dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, moving with the predatory grace of a self-made billionaire entering his own undisputed territory. Flanking him on his right side was Jasmine, walking with the sharp, lethal precision of a highly trained corporate executioner. The absolute second Derek registered the arrival of the Vanguard CEO, his entire demeanor violently shifted. His panicked, sweating face instantly transformed into a mask of desperate, sycophantic relief. He genuinely believed his ultimate corporate idol had personally arrived to restore order and save his failing presentation. He swiftly turned his back on me, practically sprinting toward the doorway with his hand eagerly outstretched. He bowed his head slightly, adopting a sickeningly submissive, groveling tone. He loudly apologized to the CEO, aggressively insisting that the completely unhinged woman sitting at the head table was entirely trespassing. He desperately promised Weston that my presence was an egregious security failure, and swore that he would have me forcefully escorted out of the building so they could resume their highly anticipated business negotiations. Weston did not take his outstretched hand. He did not slow his confident, commanding stride. He did not even offer Derek a single fleeting glance. He walked straight past my husband, as if Derek were nothing more than a minor irritating stain on the immaculate boardroom floor. Derek was left standing frozen in the middle of the room, his hands still pathetically extended in the empty air, completely paralyzed by the blatant, crushing dismissal. Weston walked directly up to the head of the long mahogany table. He stopped right beside my high-backed leather chair. He leaned down, wrapped a warm, protective arm around my structured emerald green shoulder, and pressed a brief, affectionate kiss to my cheek. "Sorry I am late," Sis Weston said. His voice was smooth, relaxed, and amplified perfectly in the cavernous, silent glass room. He slowly turned his head to look back at the sweating, paralyzed man standing awkwardly by the projector screen. He offered a sharp, dangerous smirk. "Is this the guy who mangles basic Italian?" The sheer absolute impossibility of the moment violently short-circuited the last remaining functional cells in Derek's brain. The oxygen was entirely sucked out of the room. The terrifying reality finally crashed down upon him with the absolute unstoppable crushing weight of a collapsing corporate skyscraper. "Sis!" The single syllable scraped violently against the back of Derek's throat, escaping his lips as a suffocated, pathetic gasp. He staggered backward, another half step, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin an unnatural, sickly shade of chalky white. The entire boardroom seemed to violently spin around him. The towering glass walls, the sprawling city skyline, the silent executives sitting in the shadows, everything blurred together in a dizzying, catastrophic vortex of pure panic. He stared at Weston, the billionaire corporate idol he had spent years obsessively worshipping, and then his terrified eyes slowly shifted back to me. His mind desperately tried to process the impossible, crushing mathematical equation. The uneducated country girl he had routinely mocked, the woman he had aggressively tried to force into financial submission with a draconian post-nuptial agreement, was the direct blood sister of the Vanguard Logistics CEO. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He looked like a man who had just gleefully jumped out of a plane only to realize he had forgotten to pack a parachute. Over by the refreshment console, Peyton looked equally destroyed. She shrank back against the wall, her inappropriate cocktail dress suddenly looking incredibly foolish and out of place in the sterile, high-stakes corporate environment. She frantically gripped the edge of the granite counter, her eyes darting toward the heavy glass exit doors, clearly calculating exactly how fast she could run. But there was absolutely no escape from the meticulous, devastating trap we had set. Jasmine stepped forward seamlessly, moving from Weston's side to the center of the long mahogany table. She moved with the predatory, calculating grace of an apex predator, closing in for the final lethal kill. She carried a thick, aggressively heavy legal folder in her right hand. With a swift, incredibly violent motion, she slammed the folder directly onto the polished wood surface. The sharp, thunderous crack echoed through the cavernous boardroom like a gunshot, making Derek physically flinch. Jasmine did not even bother to look at my husband. She deemed him entirely unworthy of her attention. Instead, she locked her dark, intelligent eyes directly onto Richard. As the senior partner of the firm, Richard was the only person in Derek's camp who held any actual corporate authority. Jasmine adjusted the cuffs of her flawless designer suit and stood tall, projecting absolute terrifying legal dominance. "Good morning, Richard," Jasmine said, her voice smooth, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of warmth. "Allow me to formally introduce myself. My name is Jasmine. I serve as the Chief Legal Officer and Executive Vice President for Vanguard Logistics. More importantly, for the context of today's meeting, I am Maddie's very proud sister-in-law." Richard swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously. He instinctively took a defensive step away from Derek, his seasoned corporate survival instinct screaming at him to distance himself from the epicenter of the blast. He offered a tight, incredibly strained nod to Jasmine, fully realizing that his massive, highly anticipated logistics contract was rapidly disintegrating before his very eyes. Jasmine rested her perfectly manicured hands on the thick legal folder. Richard, Vanguard Logistics prides itself on maintaining the highest possible standards of corporate synergy and financial transparency. Before we enter into any multi-million-dollar vendor agreements, my legal department conducts extremely rigorous, highly intrusive background checks on all lead representatives assigned to our accounts. We require absolute integrity from the people we do business with. She paused, letting the heavy, freezing silence stretch out to maximize the psychological torture. Derek began to visibly shake. Sweat poured down his temples, soaking the collar of his shirt. "Unfortunately," Jasmine continued, her voice dropping to a lethal razor-sharp. "Register, your lead representative has failed our mandatory background check in spectacular fashion. I am formally notifying you that Vanguard Logistics will absolutely not be doing business with your firm today. We maintain a strict, non-negotiable zero-tolerance policy for financial fraud. Under no circumstances will my company sign a contract with a firm that actively employs unrepentant active embezzlers." The word hung in the air, heavy and catastrophic. Embezzlers. Richard gasped, his eyes going wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He spun his head to glare at Derek, furious and demanding an immediate explanation. Derek let out a weak, strangled sound, shaking his head frantically side to side in a pathetic attempt at denial. But the damage was done. The absolute, impenetrable illusion of his corporate superiority was entirely shattered, leaving him completely exposed to the incoming devastating legal slaughter. He was no longer a powerful corporate climber. He was a trapped, humiliated criminal standing in a glass cage, utterly powerless against the woman he continually degraded. Richard turned a deep, explosive shade of purple, his face contorting with absolute rage. The veins in his forehead bulged dangerously against his skin as the catastrophic legal liability crashed down upon his shoulders. He closed the physical distance between himself and my husband, stepping squarely into Derek's personal space. Richard abandoned his polished corporate decorum, unleashing a deafening, furious roar that violently rattled the incredibly thick glass walls. He demanded an immediate explanation for the horrifying accusations Vanguard's chief legal officer had just leveled against their firm. He screamed his professional reputation was hanging by a frayed thread and commanded Derek to speak up. Derek physically shrank back against the table, raising his trembling hands in a pathetic, terrified, defensive gesture. He desperately stammered out a series of broken, utterly incoherent syllables, violently shaking his head and pathetically begging Richard not to believe the fabricated, malicious lies of his estranged wife. Jasmine did not allow Derek a single second to spin a false narrative. With a lethal smile, she reached across the polished mahogany table and tapped a button on her silver laptop. The massive digital projector screen spanning the front wall instantly flashed to life. Derek's stolen supply chain metrics vanished entirely, replaced by a glaring high-resolution display of detailed banking statements. The financial documents were blown up to a terrifying, unmissable scale for everyone to see. Highlighted in bright red ink were dozens of massive, undeniable wire transfers bleeding directly out of our joint household savings accounts. Jasmine expertly zoomed in on the exact receiving destination for the stolen, illicitly embezzled funds. The massive screen clearly displayed a newly registered, highly suspicious private consulting limited liability company. She then pulled up the official state registry documents alongside the bank statements. The sole proprietor, holding 100% of the executive shares for the fraudulent shell corporation, was explicitly listed in bold black letters. The name displayed on the towering screen was Peyton. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room violently shattered. Peyton took one horrified look at the massive screen and let out a piercing shriek. The absolute reality of her severe federal legal exposure instantly registered in her panic-stricken eyes. Seeing the criminal evidence documenting the fraud she was now legally tethered to, she immediately abandoned her adoration for my husband. Her survival instincts kicked into aggressive overdrive, and she viciously turned on Derek without a shred of hesitation. She quickly pushed herself forcefully away from the cold glass wall, stumbling awkwardly on her stiletto heels to physically distance herself from the man she had been clinging to moments before. She pointed a frantic, shaking finger directly at Derek's chest. Her terrified voice echoed sharply through the room as she loudly screamed that she had absolutely no idea the massive sums of money were stolen. She insisted Derek had told her the funds were legitimate corporate bonuses, divorced from his marital assets. Derek spun rapidly around to face his mistress, his eyes completely wide with absolute betrayed disbelief. The united front the cheating couple had proudly paraded into the Vanguard headquarters instantly dissolved into a public, incredibly humiliating display of vicious infighting. Derek shouted back at Peyton, accusing her of being a greedy parasite who relentlessly demanded expensive luxury shopping sprees and extravagant trips to Paris. Peyton forcefully shoved his chest, screaming that he was a broke, pathetic liar who had ruined her professional life. She frantically turned toward Richard, pleading with the senior partner to believe her innocence and begging him not to legally tie her to Derek's incredibly sloppy financial crimes. She repeatedly shouted that she was simply a naive junior consultant entirely coerced by a predatory superior. Derek roared with indignant fury, aggressively attempting to shout over her frantic, desperate pleas, thoroughly destroying whatever tiny shred of professional dignity he had left. I remained perfectly seated in my high-backed leather chair, quietly resting my chin on my tightly folded hands as I calmly watched the glorious absolute destruction unfold. Weston stood beside me, crossing his arms over his tailored charcoal suit, deeply amused by the spectacular implosion happening in the center of his immaculate boardroom. Jasmine tapped her manicured fingers against the polished wood table, her dark eyes tracking the screaming match with clinical legal fascination. The 7 Vanguard executives remained seated in the shadows, witnessing the undeniably pathetic collapse of the man who had marched into their building, demanding an executive promotion. My husband had spent 5 long years silencing me, treating me like a foolish burden who humiliated him. Now he was standing in a billionaire corporate headquarters, sweating through his expensive suit, viciously screaming at his mistress to avoid federal prison. The absolute, terrifying illusion of his unchecked power was completely and forever gone from my life. Richard had seen enough. The senior partner possessed a ruthless survival instinct honed over decades in the cutthroat financial sector, and he knew a sinking ship when he saw one. He stepped forward violently, inserting himself between the screaming, thrashing mistress and his now utterly toxic junior executive. Richard raised his hand, slicing it through the air in a sharp, definitive motion that instantly silenced their humiliating public domestic dispute. His voice cracked like a whip across the sprawling mahogany table, demanding absolute silence. He glared at Derek with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that made the younger man physically recoil. Richard did not waste his breath asking for further explanations or listening to Derek's pathetic, desperate pleas for clemency. The undeniable high-resolution bank statements glowing on the massive digital projector screen provided all the damning evidence he required. Richard squared his shoulders, his face a dark, terrifying shade of crimson. He formally announced that Derek and Peyton were both terminated from their positions effective immediately. He explicitly stated that their amateur, incredibly sloppy financial fraud had egregiously violated company policy, breached their fiduciary duties, and actively jeopardized a multi-million-dollar corporate contract with Vanguard Logistics. Richard aggressively demanded they hand over their corporate security badges and company-issued smartphones right then and there. He warned them that if they ever attempted to set foot inside the firm's building again, he would personally have them arrested for criminal trespassing. Peyton let out a sharp, devastated wail. She scrambled to unclip her security badge with shaking hands, tossing it onto the polished table like it was actively burning her skin. She grabbed her cheap designer purse, shot one final venomous glare at Derek, and sprinted out of the heavy glass doors, fleeing the boardroom as fast as her stiletto heels could carry her. She was entirely gone from his life, abandoning the sinking ship without a single backward glance. Derek remained frozen in place, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled to remove his own badge. He looked at Richard with wide, terrified eyes, begging the senior partner to reconsider, pleading that he had dedicated his entire professional life to the firm. Richard completely ignored the desperate groveling. He aggressively snatched the badge and phone directly from Derek's trembling hands. Having violently severed the cancerous tissue from his company, Richard immediately pivoted his attention toward the head of the table. His aggressive, commanding posture instantly dissolved into a sickeningly submissive display of desperate corporate groveling. He bowed his head deeply toward Weston, Jasmine, and me, his voice shaking with profound, highly rehearsed remorse. He offered his deepest, most sincere apologies to the Vanguard CEO, desperately assuring Weston that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of Derek's illicit embezzlement scheme or his highly unstable personal life. Richard turned his frantic, pleading eyes directly to me, apologizing profusely for the severe distress his former employee had caused my family. He groveled before Jasmine, begging the chief legal officer not to hold the entire firm liable for the actions of a single highly disturbed rogue agent. He promised to fully cooperate with any federal investigations Vanguard wished to pursue regarding the stolen funds. Weston did not offer a single word of comfort or reassurance. He simply stared at the sweating senior partner with freezing, calculating indifference. Recognizing that his presence was no longer required or desired, Richard began physically backing away toward the exit. He bowed his head repeatedly, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of professional dignity he had left. He pushed through the heavy frosted glass doors and disappeared down the immaculate corridor, fleeing the Vanguard headquarters to desperately save his own skin and protect his firm from the incoming legal fallout. The heavy doors slid shut with a soft, final mechanical click. The sudden silence in the room was absolute and entirely suffocating. Derek was left standing completely alone in the center of the cavernous, panoramic boardroom. The 7 Vanguard executives remained seated in the deep shadows, watching him with cold, clinical detachment. Weston stood tall and imposing at my side, radiating undeniable billionaire authority. Jasmine sat with her hands perfectly folded over her lethal legal documents, a predatory smile playing on her beautiful lips. And I sat in the high-backed leather executive chair, completely unbothered in my tailored emerald green power suit. In a matter of mere minutes, the arrogant man who had proudly marched into this corporate building, demanding an executive promotion, had been systematically stripped of his prestigious job, his stolen income, his treacherous mistress, and every single ounce of his pathetic pride. He had absolutely nothing left to hide behind, anywhere in this entire building or in this entire world. He was now a ghost, a broken, shattered shell of a man. The crushing reality of his total professional and personal annihilation finally buckled Derek's knees. He collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor of the Vanguard boardroom, landing with a heavy, pathetic thud that echoed through the terrifyingly quiet room. The man who strutted into this skyscraper demanding a prestigious title was now reduced to a sweating, trembling mess groveling at my feet. He looked up at me from the ground, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and swimming with tears. His chest heaved violently as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He reached out with shaking, clammy hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my tailored green trousers, but he was too terrified to make physical contact. "Maddie, baby, please," he choked out his voice, cracking into a high, hysterical whine. "Please, you have to listen to me. I did not know your family was like this. I had no idea you came from this kind of massive wealth. We can fix this. I love you. We are husband and wife. Please, baby, I am so sorry for everything. Give me another chance to make this right." His frantic, pathetic apologies were the ultimate insult. He was not remotely sorry for humiliating me at the restaurant. He was not sorry for his aggressive affair with his junior consultant. He was not sorry for emotionally abusing me or treating me like a worthless, uneducated burden. He was only violently apologizing because he had discovered that I possessed the exact kind of astronomical generational wealth he worshipped above all else. He was begging a billionaire heiress for mercy, not the woman he had married. I looked down at his sweating, pleading face with freezing disgust. I did not move to comfort him in any way. I did not offer a single word of gentle reassurance. I remained seated in the high-backed leather executive chair, looking at him as though he were a fascinating, repulsive insect writhing on the immaculate floor. Weston stood beside me, his jaw clenched tightly, looking absolutely disgusted by the pathetic display of male cowardice happening in his pristine boardroom. The heavy, suffocating tension was suddenly broken by a sharp, amused laugh. Jasmine stepped forward, her dark eyes flashing with pure, lethal delight. She walked seamlessly around the edge of the long mahogany table, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. She stopped right beside Derek's kneeling, trembling form. With terrifying, calculated grace, she unlatched her sleek leather briefcase and reached inside. She pulled out a thick, firmly bound stack of legal documents and held them up for Derek to clearly see. It was the exact, highly restrictive post-nuptial agreement his toxic mother Barbara had violently slammed onto our glass coffee table just a few nights ago. Jasmine looked down at my husband with a brilliant, predatory smile spreading across her face. "You really should be thanking your mother for her incredibly aggressive legal foresight, Derek," she said, her voice dripping with lethal, mocking sweetness. Barbara was absolutely right about one thing today. A spouse who is about to secure massive, life-changing corporate wealth definitely needs ironclad protection from a desperate, scheming gold digger. Derek stared blindly at the thick stack of papers, his tear-filled eyes darting frantically between Jasmine's flawless face and the printed legal document. His brain was simply too paralyzed by sheer panic to fully comprehend the massive steel trap closing tightly around his throat. Jasmine dropped the heavy legal document directly onto the polished floor right in front of his knees. "You wanted Maddie to sign this exact document to protect your imaginary corporate bonuses, Derek?" she asked, her voice dropping to a sharp, terrifyingly cold register. "Well, I have some incredibly good news for you today. We filed the necessary paperwork first thing this morning. The courts have officially processed it without any delays. You successfully executed a flawless, immediate, and total separation of all shared marital assets." Derek let out a quiet, confused gasp, his mind desperately scrambling to process her words. Jasmine leaned down slightly, making sure every single syllable hit him with maximum devastation. "You demanded a strict legal wall to completely shield your incoming money from her," she whispered coldly into his ear. "But that heavy legal wall works both ways entirely. It also irrevocably protects hers from you. You just legally locked yourself out of a $400 million vineyard syndicate. You legally surrendered any potential claim to her massive Vanguard Logistics shares. You demanded absolute financial independence, and we gladly gave it to you. You walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, Derek. Absolutely nothing." Derek let out a hollow, agonizing groan, finally realizing he had engineered his own spectacular, inescapable financial ruin and totally lost his whole world forever. Jasmine did not give him a single moment to catch his breath or process the catastrophic reality of his situation. She reached back into her sleek leather briefcase and retrieved a second, equally thick stack of heavily bound legal documents. She did not hand them to him politely. She casually dropped the heavy file directly onto the hardwood floor, letting it land with a sharp thud right between his trembling hands. Derek flinched violently, his tear-filled eyes staring down at the bold, terrifying black letters printed across the top page. It was a formal, expedited petition for divorce. Jasmine stood over him, projecting the absolute terrifying authority of a supreme corporate executioner. She coldly informed him that the divorce terms were non-negotiable and entirely merciless. Because Derek and his toxic mother had so aggressively pushed for an ironclad total separation of marital assets just a few nights prior, the legal framework was already flawlessly established. Jasmine had utilized his own greedy, paranoid legal verbiage to construct a flawless titanium cage around my entire portfolio. She clearly outlined the terms echoing through the massive boardroom. He was legally barred from requesting any form of spousal support or alimony. He held zero legal claim to the sprawling $400 million generational vineyard syndicate I stood to inherit. He possessed absolutely no rights to the highly lucrative Vanguard Logistics executive shares my family controlled. He had aggressively demanded to walk away with only his own assets. And Jasmine was enthusiastically granting his wish to the absolute letter of the law. Derek aggressively wiped the sweat and tears from his face, frantically flipping through the dense legal pages with shaking fingers. He was desperately searching for a loophole, a hidden clause, any tiny crack in the armor that might allow him to extract $1 of my staggering wealth. There was absolutely nothing. Jasmine was a top-tier corporate attorney who ruthlessly protected billion-dollar assets for a living. She had sealed every single exit. Derek let out a ragged, desperate sob, burying his face in his hands. He realized he was walking out of our marriage exactly as he had entered it, but now stripped of his prestigious job, his income, and the luxury lifestyle he had entirely taken for granted. But Jasmine was not finished delivering the devastating blows. She let out a sharp, dismissive sigh, reaching into her briefcase one final time. She pulled out a third folder, this one marked with bright red priority tabs. She dropped it forcefully right on top of the divorce petition. Derek stared blindly at the new stack of papers, his body physically shaking with pure, unadulterated terror. He had absolutely no capacity left to absorb any more catastrophic damage. Jasmine leaned down slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his panicked, sweating face. She served him with a devastating civil lawsuit. She clearly explained that this aggressive legal action was demanding immediate total restitution for the massive sums of money he had systematically embezzled from our joint household savings accounts. She explicitly detailed how he had illicitly funneled those stolen marital funds directly into Peyton's fraudulent consulting shell corporation. She coldly informed him that we had comprehensive, undeniable digital proof of every single unauthorized wire transfer he had authorized over the past 6 months. Derek gasped for air, his chest heaving violently. He desperately tried to argue frantically, claiming that he intended to pay the money back with the massive executive bonus he thought he was securing today. Jasmine cut him off with a lethal, mocking laugh. She sharply reminded him that he was currently an unemployed blacklisted fraud who had just been publicly fired by his senior partner. His primary bank accounts were entirely frozen by federal fraud investigators. He had completely maxed out his high-interest credit cards, buying luxury designer items for a mistress who had just abandoned him in this very boardroom. He had absolutely zero incoming revenue and absolutely no viable way to secure new employment in the corporate financial sector ever again. Jasmine stood tall, towering over his pathetic kneeling form, and delivered the final crushing mathematical reality. She stated he was now personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen funds, legal fees, and aggressive punitive damages. If he attempted to fight the civil lawsuit in court, She promised to immediately hand the undeniable financial evidence over to federal prosecutors and push for severe criminal embezzlement charges. Derek stared down at the towering stack of legal documents scattered across the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute destruction. He finally understood the terrifying truth. He was not just broke and unemployed. He was legally permanently buried under a massive, crushing mountain of inescapable debt he could never repay in his entire lifetime. While Derek remained trapped on the executive floor, paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his legal ruin, a different disaster was rapidly unfolding 50 stories below. During the initial chaotic moments of his boardroom exposure before Jasmine severed his professional and financial lifelines, Derek managed to fire off a single frantic text message. In a blind panic, he texted his mother, Barbara. He sent a garbled, desperate plea for help, claiming his incredibly jealous wife had infiltrated his highly anticipated corporate meeting to aggressively sabotage his career. He begged his mother to rush down to the Vanguard headquarters to rescue him. Barbara, completely oblivious to the devastating fact that her son was an unemployed embezzler facing massive federal fraud charges, eagerly answered the call. She hailed a taxi, fully expecting to march into a corporate skyscraper and easily intimidate a weak, uneducated country girl into absolute submission. She truly believed she was about to secure her son's massive logistics contract and bully me into signing the oppressive postnuptial agreement right in the lobby. The heavy glass revolving doors of the immaculate Vanguard lobby spun violently as Barbara aggressively shoved her way inside. She completely disrupted the quiet, sophisticated atmosphere of the towering financial hub. She was dressed head to toe in her usual, painfully obvious counterfeit designer brands, clutching her fake luxury handbag like a weapon. She stomped across the pristine marble floor, her cheap heels clicking loudly and erratically. She marched directly up to the main security reception desk, completely bypassing the polite, orderly line of waiting corporate visitors. Without offering a single greeting, Barbara slammed her hands down onto the polished granite counter. She loudly demanded immediate access to the executive boardroom, aggressively snapping her fingers right in the face of the head receptionist. She shrieked that she was the mother of Vanguard's newest, most important executive partner, and she demanded to speak to the pathetic farm girl who was currently trespassing on the property. The receptionist maintained a mask of cold, flawless professional courtesy. She did not flinch, nor did she attempt to argue with the increasingly unhinged woman. She simply pressed a silent security alert button hidden beneath her desk. Barbara took this silence as an invitation to escalate her completely baseless outrage. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, causing a massive, incredibly humiliating public scene. She furiously demanded massive financial compensation for her son, aggressively claiming that I had maliciously wasted his highly valuable time and deliberately damaged his pristine corporate reputation. She shouted to the entire lobby that I was a broke, scheming gold digger who owed her brilliant son millions of dollars in emotional damages. The highly trained Vanguard security detail materialized instantly. 6 towering, heavily muscled guards dressed in immaculate dark suits swiftly surrounded Barbara. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, quickly forming an impenetrable human wall around her to contain her explosive, embarrassing outburst. They did not physically touch her, strictly adhering to corporate liability protocols, but their sheer intimidating presence forced her to temporarily stop her aggressive forward momentum. Barbara violently spun around, wildly pointing her finger at the silent security team. She shrieked that they were making a massive career-ending mistake. She loudly threatened to personally sue every single guard in the building, aggressively claiming her son was about to buy this entire company and fire all of them by the end of the day. She puffed out her chest, completely blind to the reality that she was making an absolute fool of herself in front of dozens of high-level financial employees. Just as Barbara opened her mouth to launch into another hysterical, deafening tirade, a sharp, clear chime echoed across the sprawling marble lobby. The digital display above the private high-security executive elevator illuminated with a bright, glowing green light. The heavy steel doors slid silently apart, revealing the immaculate interior. I stepped out of the elevator first. My tailored emerald green power suit caught the bright lobby lighting, projecting absolute, undeniable authority. The country girl she expected to easily bully was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless, unbothered heiress commanding total control of her environment. Walking smoothly right beside me was Weston, projecting the terrifying silent power of a billionaire CEO operating in his own undisputed domain. Flanking my other side was Jasmine, her sharp eyes locked onto Barbara with lethal, calculating legal precision. We walked in perfect synchronized unison across the pristine marble floor directly toward the chaotic, screaming woman who had spent 5 years trying to make me feel small. The security guards instantly parted, without a single spoken command, creating a wide, clear, and highly dramatic path for us to directly face her. Barbara saw me approach and immediately lunged forward. She tried to physically step toward me, aggressively swinging her counterfeit designer handbag as if it were a weapon. She loudly shrieked that I was a pathetic, ungrateful farm girl who had ruined her brilliant son's life. She demanded that I drop to my knees and apologize for maliciously sabotaging his massive corporate deal. She screamed a furious barrage of vicious insults, wildly claiming that I had tricked my way into this building using stolen money. Her face was bright red, twisted with rage. She genuinely believed her sheer volume could intimidate me back into the silent corner I occupied for years. I did not flinch. I did not take a step backward. I stood still in my tailored emerald green suit, radiating an aura of absolute freezing calm. The security team immediately tightened their circle around her, blocking her aggressive path. Before Barbara could launch into another deafening tirade, Jasmine stepped smoothly in front of me. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She spoke with the chilling, lethal precision of a corporate attorney who regularly dismantled empires. She looked directly into Barbara's furious eyes and firmly instructed her to close her mouth. Jasmine formally informed Barbara that the local police were already on their way. She explicitly stated that law enforcement had been officially dispatched to arrest her for criminal trespassing, public disturbance, and targeted harassment within a secure financial headquarters. Barbara scoffed loudly, attempting to maintain her aggressive, arrogant posture. She puffed out her chest and shrieked that she could never be arrested because her son was currently upstairs signing a multi-million-dollar executive contract with the CEO. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Jasmine, threatening to have her immediately fired for daring to speak to a vital corporate VIP in such a disrespectful manner. Weston let out a sharp, deeply amused laugh. He crossed his arms over his tailored charcoal suit and stared at the hysterical woman with profound clinical pity. He did not bother to introduce himself or explain his identity. He simply allowed Jasmine to continue the flawless, devastating execution. Jasmine smiled a cold, predatory smile. She informed Barbara that her son was not signing any contracts today or any other day. She clearly explained that Derek was currently upstairs, trapped in a boardroom, utterly paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his own criminal actions. Jasmine revealed that Vanguard Logistics possessed comprehensive, undeniable digital proof of his federal financial fraud. Barbara froze, the aggressive, arrogant color rapidly draining from her face as the heavy legal terminology began to register. Her mouth opened and closed in silent, terrified confusion. I stepped out from behind Jasmine, closing the final physical distance between myself and my former mother-in-law. I looked Barbara up and down with absolute, freezing calm. I took my time, allowing my gaze to slowly travel over her cheap imitation clothing and her panicked, sweating face. I wanted her to feel the full, crushing weight of her absolute insignificance. "Your son is a broke, unemployed fraud who just got fired on a projector screen," I stated. My voice was lethal, completely devoid of any emotion, ringing out clearly across the sprawling, silent marble lobby. I leaned in slightly, ensuring she caught every single syllable of her total destruction. I handed him the divorce papers right there on the hardwood floor. He is legally buried under a mountain of inescapable debt. Good luck protecting his wealth now. The devastating truth hit Barbara with the force of a speeding freight train. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. The aggressive, bullying facade she had weaponized for years instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She realized in one terrifying moment that her son was not a wealthy corporate titan and I was not a weak, defenseless target. She had spent 5 years treating a billionaire heiress like worthless dirt, and the ultimate, inescapable consequences had finally arrived to collect their heavy due. Barbara was left completely speechless. Her jaw hung open, her vocal cords entirely paralyzed by the catastrophic, crushing magnitude of her son's total ruin. She could not formulate a single word of defense or denial. She simply stared at my tailored emerald green suit, the terrifying reality of her massive miscalculation freezing her exactly in place. I gave a sharp nod to the waiting security team. The guards immediately moved in, grasping Barbara by both arms. They turned her around and began marching her toward the revolving glass doors. She did not struggle. She did not scream or demand financial compensation. She was dragged out of the pristine Vanguard lobby in humiliating silence, completely stripped of her toxic arrogance. I watched her disappear onto the city street, feeling a profound surge of liberated peace. The ensuing weeks unfolded with a rapid, merciless precision that dismantled every single pillar of Derek's fabricated existence. I did not need to lift another finger to ensure his total destruction. The flawless legal and financial traps Jasmine had activated executed their purpose automatically. The immediate fallout from the Vanguard boardroom disaster was cataclysmic. Derek attempted to salvage his shattered ego by taking Peyton out to a lavish, obscenely expensive dinner that very same night, desperate to project an illusion of control. When the waiter brought the bill, Derek confidently handed over one of his high-interest credit cards. It was instantly declined. He frantically produced a second card, then a third. Every single piece of plastic he possessed bounced, triggering loud, humiliating alerts on the restaurant's payment terminal. The massive shopping spree they had enjoyed just days prior had completely maxed out his available credit. And with his primary bank accounts heavily frozen by federal fraud investigators, he possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. Peyton was forced to empty her own designer purse just to cover the tip, glaring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. That humiliating dinner was merely the opening act of his rapid, steep descent into absolute ruin. 2 days later, a sharp knock echoed through the hallway of our luxury downtown apartment. A stern legal courier stood at the door, handing Derek a heavily stamped envelope. It was a formal, non-negotiable 3-day eviction notice for immediate non-payment of rent. Derek aggressively attempted to call the building's management company, screaming that he had tenant rights and demanding an extension. The leasing agent calmly informed him of a fatal detail he had completely ignored when he arrogantly signed the paperwork 5 years ago. The sprawling high-end residential tower was actively owned and managed by a commercial real estate subsidiary. That subsidiary was entirely controlled by my family's private generational trust. He was essentially a delinquent tenant occupying my personal property, and the management company was ruthlessly executing its legal right to forcefully remove him. Realizing the terrifying severity of his total financial collapse, Peyton did not waste a single moment standing by her disgraced, broke lover. The absolute second she comprehended that the massive Vanguard contract was dead and the luxury apartment was being seized, her survival instincts overrode any lingering shred of false affection. While Derek was frantically pacing the living room and screaming at bank representatives on the phone, Peyton methodically packed her 3 oversized suitcases. She did not shed a single tear or offer a comforting embrace. She coldly informed Derek that she refused to tie her vibrant youth to an unemployed blacklisted criminal drowning in a massive sea of inescapable federal debt. Within an hour, she had a luxury rideshare waiting at the curb. She abandoned him completely, immediately moving into the sprawling penthouse of a wealthy, highly successful commercial gym owner she had been secretly messaging for weeks. She severed all ties with Derek, blocking his phone number and completely erasing him from her digital footprint before her car even turned the corner. Stripped of his prestigious career, his stolen income, his luxury housing, and his treacherous mistress, Derek was violently forced to face the bleak, humiliating reality of his new existence. He packed his remaining clothes into garbage bags and took a humiliating subway ride to his mother's cramped, incredibly cluttered apartment in the outer boroughs. The man who had strutted into a billionaire headquarters demanding an executive promotion was now reduced to sleeping on Barbara's uncomfortable, sagging sofa. The tiny apartment quickly became a suffocating prison of mutual resentment and unending daily arguments. Barbara constantly berated him for completely ruining his life and failing to secure my massive wealth, while Derek aggressively blamed his mother for aggressively forcing the catastrophic post-nuptial agreement that permanently sealed his legal doom. His professional ostracization was absolute and immediate. Richard had ensured that Derek's egregious financial fraud was quietly but thoroughly communicated across the tight-knit corporate financial sector. Every desperate job application Derek submitted was instantly rejected. Industry headhunters refused to return his frantic phone calls, deleting his extensive resume without a second thought. He was entirely blacklisted, branded as an incredibly toxic liability that no reputable firm would ever dare touch. Simultaneously, the heavy legal fees from Jasmine's aggressive civil lawsuit began to ruthlessly pile up, adding to his misery. Massive stacks of threatening legal notices and collection agency demands flooded Barbara's small mailbox every single day, demanding payments he could not afford. He was utterly trapped under a crushing, suffocating mountain of legal and financial consequences. He had spent 5 years desperately trying to build an empire of lies, and now he was permanently buried under the devastating, unyielding rubble of his own spectacular collapse. As the crushing reality of his total isolation fully set in, Derek hit absolute, undeniable rock bottom. Sitting on the sagging cushions of his mother's cramped sofa, surrounded by a terrifying mountain of final collection notices and aggressively worded legal threats, he finally broke. The overwhelming arrogance that had defined his entire adult life entirely evaporated, replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. He stared at his cracked smartphone screen, his thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard as he prepared to launch one final pathetic Hail Mary attempt at survival. He opened our text thread, a digital space that had been completely silent since the day I walked out of our luxury apartment. He began to type frantically, his thumbs flying across the screen as he composed a massive multi-paragraph wall of pure, unfiltered groveling. He did not offer a genuine apology. Instead, he immediately launched into a sickening display of aggressive blame-shifting. He viciously threw his toxic mother entirely under the bus, claiming Barbara had aggressively manipulated him into forcing the restrictive post-nuptial agreement upon me. He swore he never actually wanted me to sign it, completely rewriting history to paint himself as a helpless victim of his mother's financial greed. Next, he turned his pathetic crosshairs onto Peyton. He aggressively villainized his former mistress, insisting she had completely brainwashed him and practically forced him to embezzle the joint household funds to feed her insatiable shopping addiction. He claimed he was blinded by severe professional stress and made a terrible, uncharacteristic mistake. After thoroughly blaming the two women who had fed his massive ego, he pivoted to his ultimate desperate goal. He begged me for a second chance, pleading for us to attend intensive marital counseling to rebuild our broken foundation. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me, swearing his undying love. Then, buried at the very bottom of the massive text wall, was the true reason for his digital outreach. He pathetically asked me for a temporary small financial loan. He claimed he just needed a minor cash injection from my massive inheritance to avoid officially declaring federal bankruptcy and going to federal prison. He promised to pay me back with interest, genuinely believing I was still the compliant, easily manipulated woman he had controlled for 5 years. He hit send, his hands shaking violently, and waited for my response. I was sitting on the sunlit terrace of my family's sprawling vineyard estate in Tuscany when my phone vibrated softly against the cast-iron table. I picked up the device and saw his name flash across the screen. I opened the message, allowing the read receipt to immediately notify him that I was actively viewing his desperate plea. I read through the massive wall of text, sipping a flawless, incredibly expensive vintage Amarone. I did not feel a single ounce of pity, anger, or sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating indifference. His frantic words were nothing more than the pathetic thrashing of a drowning man who had deliberately drilled holes in his own boat. I did not reply immediately. I set the phone face up on the table and let it sit there. I went about my beautiful, entirely unbothered life. I attended high-level executive board meetings for the Vanguard Logistics European expansion. I walked through the generational vineyards inspecting the harvest, with the same authentic passion I had nurtured since childhood. I slept deeply and peacefully in my luxurious suite, completely free from his suffocating control. For 3 full days, I left him entirely on red. I knew exactly what that digital silence was doing to him. I knew he was staring at his cracked screen in his mother's cramped apartment, watching the read receipt glow mockingly, his anxiety skyrocketing with every passing hour. He was trapped in an agonizing purgatory of his own making, desperately waiting for a lifeline that was never going to arrive. He was forced to sit in the absolute ruins of his life, entirely ignored by the billionaire heiress he thought he could discard. On the morning of this 4th day, I finally picked up my phone. The sun was rising beautifully over the rolling Tuscan hills, painting the sky in vibrant shades of gold and deep violet. I opened our text thread one final time. I did not write a massive emotional paragraph addressing his pathetic excuses or his desperate request for a financial bailout. He was entirely unworthy of my time, my money, and my intellect. I tapped the keyboard, my mind instantly recalling the spectacular restaurant humiliation he had tried to orchestrate, which ultimately sparked his absolute downfall. I typed a single flawless sentence in perfect regional Italian. Arrivederci fallito. Goodbye, failure. I hit send, watching the small blue bubble pop onto the screen. I did not wait for his inevitable frantic response. With a swift, decisive tap of my finger, I permanently blocked his phone number. I deleted his contact information entirely from my device, completely erasing his digital footprint from my existence. The heavy, suffocating cord that had tied me to his toxic, arrogant world was finally and irrevocably severed. I set the phone down, took a deep breath of the crisp Italian air, and smiled. My new life had officially begun, and it was absolutely magnificent. 6 months passed with the breathtaking speed of a sudden summer storm finally clearing the suffocating air. The heavy, oppressive gray skies of my former life in the city were entirely replaced by the endless sun-drenched expanse of my family's generational estate in Tuscany. My new life had indeed begun, and today it was on full glorious display. It was late afternoon, and the golden hour light cast a warm, magnificent glow over the sprawling stone terraces of our historic villa. We were hosting our annual philanthropic charity gala, an exclusive, highly anticipated international event designed to raise millions of dollars for sustainable agricultural development across the globe. The ancient estate was completely transformed into a breathtaking paradise. Cascading floral arrangements of white roses and lush greenery draped over the classical marble columns. Elegant crystal lighting caught the fading sunlight, and the soft, melodic sounds of a live string quartet floated effortlessly through the crisp, fragrant Italian air. I moved effortlessly through the vibrant, elegantly dressed crowd, feeling the heavy stone of the terrace beneath my designer heels. I was wearing a stunning custom-tailored crimson silk gown that moved like liquid fire, a fierce and deliberate contrast to the muted, apologetic clothing I had worn for 5 agonizing years to appease a deeply insecure man. The atmosphere around me was incredibly warm, inviting, and filled with genuine, unforced respect. High-profile guests ranging from international diplomats to global financial titans eagerly sought out my company. They did not talk over me, dismiss my intellect, or demand I remain quietly in the shadows. They actively asked for my expert opinions on global market trends, agricultural supply chains, and international trade tariffs. I was no longer a silent prop. I was the undisputed center of gravity. I stood near the grand tasting table, completely in my element, surrounded by an eager audience of elite philanthropists. I picked up a heavy specialized corkscrew and expertly opened a rare, highly coveted bottle from our private reserve. It was a spectacular $4,000 vintage Amarone, the exact same wine that had triggered Derek's fragile explosive ego all those months ago. The rich ruby liquid flowed smoothly into the delicate crystal glasses. I flawlessly explained the precise regional slope the grapes hailed from the exact mineral composition of the soil and the specific weather patterns of that glorious harvest year. The surrounding guests listened with rapt, undivided attention, raising their glasses to toast my unparalleled expertise and the profound elegance of the estate. As I handed a perfectly poured glass to a visiting French ambassador, a familiar, deeply comforting laugh carried over the gentle hum of the sophisticated crowd. I turned to see Weston and Jasmine making their way across the grand stone terrace, parting the sea of elite guests with their natural, undeniable gravity. My brother looked incredibly relaxed, his usual terrifying corporate billionaire armor traded for a sharp, perfectly tailored cream linen suit, perfectly suited for the luxurious Italian countryside. Jasmine walked right beside him, radiating absolute joy, in a brilliant emerald green dress that caught the golden sunlight and mirrored the vibrant vineyards surrounding us. They were holding hands, their fingers tightly intertwined, leaning into each other with the kind of effortless, authentic love that entirely grounded our powerful family. They bypassed the endless high-level networking opportunities and walked directly over to my tasting station. Weston pulled me into a tight, incredibly warm embrace, kissing my cheek and proudly declaring that the gala had already shattered its previous fundraising records by tens of millions of dollars, largely due to my flawless organizational strategy. Jasmine took a crystal glass of the vintage Amarone from the table. She raised it in a silent, deeply respectful toast, her dark eyes shining with immense pride for the unbreakable woman I had fully become. We stood together laughing openly, sharing a quiet, impenetrable bond of absolute loyalty. They were not just my family. They were my fiercest allies, the brilliant architects who had helped me execute my perfect liberation. The terrifying, suffocating nightmare of Derek, his toxic mother and his pathetic mistress, felt like it belonged to an entirely different, incredibly distant lifetime. They were just insignificant dust, permanently swept away by the unstoppable force of my reclaimed reality. I excused myself from the immediate conversation, leaving Weston and Jasmine to playfully debate the wine's tasting notes. I walked slowly toward the edge of the grand stone balcony, the cool evening breeze brushing gently against my face. I rested my hands on the warm, ancient stone railing and looked out over the endless, meticulously maintained rows of grapevines stretching infinitely toward the distant horizon. The rolling Tuscan hills were bathed in brilliant, fiery gold as the sun began to dip below the distant tree line. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of the fragrant, earthy air. I did not have to shrink myself down to fit into a tiny, fragile box ever again. I was the sole heiress to a massive empire, a brilliant corporate strategist, and a woman who had orchestrated her own flawless, absolute freedom. I looked at the beautiful, sprawling world laid out entirely at my feet, finally experiencing a profound, unshakable, and total peace. Standing there with the cool Italian breeze gently sweeping across the grand stone balcony, I allowed my mind to finally process the sheer magnitude of the journey I had just completed. For 5 agonizingly long years, I had deliberately folded myself into a tiny, suffocating shape just to fit comfortably inside a life built entirely on my husband's fragile insecurities. I had convinced myself that keeping the peace required absolute silence. I had believed that being a supportive partner meant actively hiding my own brilliance so Derek could desperately try to shine. Looking back at that timid, compliant version of myself, I felt a deep wave of profound empathy for the woman I used to be. But more importantly, I felt a fierce, undeniable pride for the woman who had finally decided to burn that fake life to the ground. Divorcing Derek was never a tragedy. The dissolution of our legally binding contract was not a heartbreaking loss or a monumental failure to be mourned. I realized with crystal clarity that losing a toxic, controlling husband was simply the highly effective surgical removal of a deeply entrenched parasite. Derek had never loved me. He had merely fed on my emotional grace, actively siphoned my hidden financial resources, and shamelessly stolen my intellectual labor to prop up his own pathetic illusions of grandeur. He was a leech who thrived entirely in the dark, desperately terrified of the moment I would finally turn on the blinding spotlight of my true identity. I had not just survived his emotional abuse and his ridiculous financial warfare. I had completely and ruthlessly reclaimed my entire existence. The uneducated, clueless country girl he so arrogantly mocked was actually the impenetrable bedrock of a $400 million empire, and she had officially collected every single debt he owed. I turned my gaze away from the darkening Tuscan horizon and looked back toward the vibrant, glowing heart of the charity gala. The live string quartet was playing a lively, joyful symphony that perfectly matched the electric energy of the evening. Through the elegant glass doors of the villa, I watched Weston and Jasmine laughing together, sharing a quiet, intimate joke amidst the swirling crowd of global elites. They were the absolute definition of a true, impenetrable partnership. They did not compete with one another for the spotlight. They did not demand submission or enforce financial control to validate their own worth. They operated as a unified, devastatingly effective team, perfectly secure in their individual power. That was what real family looked like. It was not the toxic, backstabbing, superficial loyalty Derek and his mother had weaponized. It was a fiercely protective, unconditionally supportive fortress. I walked slowly back toward the center of the grand terrace, the heavy silk of my crimson gown sweeping elegantly across the ancient stone floor. Weston caught my eye as I approached. He smiled that familiar, knowing smirk that signaled a shared, unspoken victory. Jasmine stepped up beside him, her brilliant dark eyes reflecting the warm, ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. I stopped in front of them, feeling the absolute, unbreakable strength of the blood and loyalty that bound us together. I raised my delicate crystal glass, the rich vintage Amarone catching the light like a perfect, flawless ruby. Weston and Jasmine immediately raised their glasses to meet mine. We did not need to offer a lengthy emotional speech or recount the spectacular corporate execution we had flawlessly pulled off 6 months prior. The absolute destruction of Derek's arrogant, fraudulent world was a closed chapter permanently filed away in the dusty archives of my past. We were no longer looking backward. We clinked our glasses together, the sharp, clear chime ringing out like a final victorious declaration over the beautiful Tuscan estate. As the rich, complex wine settled warmly on my palate, the ultimate resounding lesson of this entire ordeal crystallized perfectly in my mind. It is a terrifyingly common trap to believe that love requires profound self-sacrifice, but genuine love will never ask you to surrender your core identity. Never under any circumstances shrink yourself to fit comfortably into the narrow confines of someone else's fragile life. If a partner demands that you dim your brilliant light tone, down your sharp intellect, or hide your massive success just to make them feel superior, they are simply too small, too insecure, and too painfully arrogant to ever appreciate the massive empire you already own. You do not owe your silence to anyone's insecurity. I lowered my glass and looked out at the magnificent, sprawling world that belonged entirely to me. I felt the warm, gentle embrace of my true family standing right by my side. The heavy chains of my past were permanently shattered, leaving nothing but an unwritten, fiercely independent future ahead. A slow, genuinely triumphant smile spread across my face, brighter and far more powerful than the Tuscan sun, as I turned back to the glowing party and stepped flawlessly into the rest of my beautiful life. The most profound lesson from Maddie's journey is that true strength lies in refusing to diminish your brilliance to comfort an insecure partner. She hid her intellect and wealth to protect a fragile ego only to face betrayal. Her story illustrates that shrinking yourself never secures genuine love, it only invites exploitation. We must embrace our full potential and surround ourselves with people who celebrate our power rather than fear it. Stop apologizing for your success and start walking fiercely in your own truth today.